Mari and I, my wife here and I, are good friends of Daniel and his beautiful wife Alana and their little boy Micah, and they've got another one on the way, so it gives me great pleasure. I'm really proud to be able to introduce you tonight. But before, I remember when I haven't been on the board for a good while here at the museum, and I really love this place for a lot of reasons, but when I first started to volunteer here at the museum and served on the board before then, the idea of shipwrecks were just fascinating to me, as they are, I'm sure, to many of you. Tragedies, to be sure, but sources of great fascination. I remember we've got the model of the Cuba around here someplace. I didn't see it tonight, but it is here, and it is sunk at San Miguel. We've got the display about the Honda tragedy, which you'll all look at in a movie next month. We've got the Winfield Scott exhibit over here, all of which had me out. And then we had on the board Robert Schwimmer, who's like the world expert in shipwrecks. He always had stories that were just unbelievable. He's discovered wonderful treasures under the water for the National Oceanic Administration, and really done great work. So it's been a great fascination. Well, Daniel has he's put story to all of this, and some really great anecdotes, and I'm sure that you all will love hearing from him. But I have a very formal introduction as well, and so I'll read that to you. But tonight I am pleased to welcome to the museum fellow Santa Barbaran Daniel Stone, who's a national best-selling writer of adventure, history, and science. No kidding. He's a former senior editor with National Geographic, a former White House correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Daniel is a professor of environmental science and policy at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches environmental communication, history, and storytelling. He's an occasional contributor to the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and Vice. What do you contribute to Vice? I'm not sure I understand that. And, that's the name of a magazine. I got it, okay. And he has presented at the National Academy of Sciences. Daniel's first book, if you have not read his first book, I recommend it highly, and that is The Food Explorer. That was a national bestseller, selected as the American Horticultural Society Book of the Year, and is currently in development for a TV series, which I'm looking forward to. He will detail for us tonight his most recent book, Sinkable, released last year. The book is about shipwrecks. The Titanic story kind of holds it together, but it's also about the deep sea and the strange underworld of shipwreck obsession, which I almost got hooked in, all of which were very recently and tragically front and center in the news. And Daniel was a guest on the Today Show with this business, with all that unfolding Ocean Gate drama, you remember, not very long ago. When the poor people died on their way down to take a look at the Titanic. Sinkable, the book, is available for sale at a table over here immediately after this presentation, and also in our museum store and online on Amazon. And now please join me in welcoming Daniel Stone. Oh, you want the mic.
Thank you, Hank. Oh, thank you, Marie, for hosting tonight. Thank you, all of you, for being here and having me in this wonderfully beautiful space that means so much of us who are from here and who live here. This is a real treat to be able to talk about this book and these stories, particularly here. As Hank mentioned, this is a story about shipwreck obsession, and he was lucky to be spared that obsession. I got sucked in. I got sucked in pretty hard. This was most of my project during COVID, to dive very deep into shipwrecks and the weird world of people who get obsessed with shipwrecks, and the history of some of the most fascinating wrecks, with the North Star always being the Titanic. And I'll explain a little why it became the North Star. But I want to take you on a journey tonight about shipwrecks in general. Okay, and this is already a better crowd than the students I teach. So, A+, yeah. I started researching this book, and I started with this question in my head of how many shipwrecks are there in the world? What's the body of numbers that we're talking about? And it got very big very fast. I started to ask a lot of people what they thought, and everybody was wrong. And so I found this map, and I marveled at this map, like many of you just did, thinking, wow, that's a lot of shipwrecks. And then I read the caption under this map that said, these are only shipwrecks from World War II, right? That's it. And you can see the hot spots around Europe, around East Asia. You know, these are not all giant ships, but these are wrecks that sank generally in the 30s and the 40s. The broader number of ships that sank all time, all over the world, in every body of water, UNESCO estimates at 3 million shipwrecks. And they also admit that that's kind of a guess, and that the number is probably a lot higher. And so when you start to think of how much diversity of shipwrecks there are in the world, it starts to kind of make sense that this is how humans traveled for almost all of human history, that almost every ship becomes a wreck eventually, and that most of them are still sitting underwater somewhere undiscovered. There are, of course, the famous wrecks. This is the Endurance. That was very famous and very popular in the news last year when it was found. This is Ernest Shackleton's ship, Endurance, that was found in Antarctica under about almost 2 miles of icy water. Made big news. There's another famous one here. We might remember, someone said it, yeah, Costa Concordia. This one sank off of Italy about 10 years ago. This one was less graceful. Captain ran on some rocks, slowly took on water, nobody died, but the ship did have to be scrapped. This is a crowd favorite. This is a great crowd, yeah. This is the Vasa. This is the most popular tourist attraction in Sweden. This is sometimes called the Swedish Titanic because it sank on its maiden voyage, I think in 1628, for an unfortunate reason that the gun ports were put a little too low toward the waterline. A slight gust of wind kind of knocked the sails over a little, and the gun ports started filling with water, and the Vasa sank. Most interesting is that 400 years passed, and then the Swedish government pulled up the Vasa, salvaged it, restored it, and now it's sitting in a museum, and you could walk around and I think even in parts of the Vasa. But there are much less famous wrecks too. Wrecks in places you would never expect. This is under a cornfield in Kansas, part of the world where you'd never expect to see a wreck, but there used to be rivers, there are rivers, places where there used to be bends in rivers and are no more. Ships that got stuck on rocks would get buried under dirt. And over the course of centuries, it became a lot of dirt. Here's a wreck in the desert of Namibia in West Africa. Again, places where there used to be water and hasn't been for a long time. And what we have are these time capsules that hold these stories, this relic of the world at a different time. There is even a wreck that was found under Ground Zero in New York City after the towers were cleared. This is an old merchant ship from the founding days of Manhattan. And interestingly, Manhattan used to be a smaller island, especially toward the bottom. It did not extend as far. And the island was extended by using fill from merchant ships like this one that sailed to Manhattan, and no one had use for the ship anymore, and so they piled ships on top of dirt, and that explains much of lower Manhattan now. The same is true for much of San Francisco. People who came for gold, prospecting gold, did not care about their ships as soon as they got there, and so much of San Francisco is built upon old wrecks. This is a map of our channel here that was published in the Santa Barbara Independent a couple years ago. I don't know exactly how they found the pinpointed locations of many of these wrecks, but there are a lot of wrecks here very locally. In fact, before I get to some of them, I'll just mention that I heard from an underwater wreck expert who told me that anywhere on Earth that you are, you're never more than a couple miles from a wreck. Anywhere, right? That's on land, that's in the desert, that's around rivers, that's in the ocean, in the Arctic, Antarctic, everywhere. So it makes sense that here we have hundreds, if not thousands of wrecks, some of which we know about, many of which we don't. This is one of my favorites. I'm actually going to ask this crowd, I have a few of these, if anyone can identify which one this is. Okay, this is the Chickasaw, which was an old World War II troop ship that carried a lot of soldiers from California to Japan and back several times. It became a private ship after the war and was sold to a company in the 1960s and ended up running aground off near Santa Rosa Island in 1967, where it has stayed ever since. And this is the Chickasaw on one of its better days. Some days it doesn't look nearly as good. Some days it disappears under the tide. The water and the sun are constantly ripping this ship apart, as every ship is that's above water, even partly like this one. This is a very special one that I like. This one's called the Kate and Anna. This was a very famous Santa Barbara ship in the early 20th century, 1902, that was a whale and otter hunting ship that happened to run aground, unfortunately, on San Miguel Island one night, and it got buried in this sand. So this photo is taken in the sand, and all these jokers had the idea one day to climb up there and pose with it and take this wonderful photo from 1902. And then Hank mentioned the Cuba. This is the Cuba that probably needs no introduction, but the Cuba is also in our waters here, a ship that sank in, I think, 1926, sometime in the 20s, and was instantly fascinating because it was carrying silver bullion and mahogany and very high-end coffee. And so this set off a rush for not just finding where the ship was, but also trying to get what was on it. There are a few major reasons people go looking for ships that I found, and I place them into three categories. Ships that are old, ships that are famous, and we'll get to the third category in just a moment. But we'll start with ships that are old. And the oldest shipwrecks on Earth are uniquely found in one place. Well, the Mediterranean, and specifically the Black Sea. Okay, the Black Sea between Eastern Europe and Central Asia is home to old Roman and Greek era shipwrecks. Ships made of wood with their ropes made of organic fibers. And as we all know, anywhere on Earth that wood exists, it usually corrodes, right? It doesn't last very long when exposed to the elements. But underwater in the Black Sea, a uniquely suited part of the Earth for shipwreck preservation because it is very deep, very dark, low salinity, and salt is usually what tears ships apart. And so if you can minimize light and salt as you can in the Black Sea, you can keep a wooden shipwreck alive, basically intact, for thousands of years. And so these photos are not great because they're taken more than 1.5 miles underwater. But if you looked close, you could see some of the wood carvings on parts of these ships and on its helm, wood carvings that, again, are thousands of years old. So for a place for underwater archaeologists to really have a field day, it's in the Black Sea. The famous shipwrecks are the ones that get really charismatic coverage. And again, this is the Endurance I mentioned earlier. Ernest Shackleton's ship. This was the last photo taken of it in 1915 before it got sandwiched and crushed by ice floes. Shackleton and his crew went on this harrowing adventure. Almost all survived and lived to tell the tale about it. But 107 years later, the Endurance was found, and here's its headline in the New York Times. This was last year. The Endurance was found at almost the same depth as the Titanic, a little more than 2 miles deep, in one of the most punishing places in the world for looking for wrecks. Cold weather, icy waters, rough seas, and depth, extreme depth. But the Endurance was worth it for all of that and all of the money, time, and expense because it's famous. It had this great story behind it that any other wreck probably wouldn't have gotten that much attention and focus. The same is true for the Titanic, a super charismatic ship that almost doesn't deserve its amount of fame, right? Considering all of its characteristics. It was not the first ship to sink on its maiden voyage. It was not the first ship to kill a lot of people, and it was certainly not the first ship to hit an iceberg. But something about the timing of when it sank, the era that it went down, and the storytelling that came after kept the Titanic and the Endurance in people's imaginations for decades, at a point where they could be incorporated into books and movies and some really flashy high-end movies that kept telling the story over and over. So the Endurance is a ship like any other, but it was worth finding because it was so famous. Here's another famous one. This is, of course, a rendering, because it's really old. This is the battleship, the Maine, right? Remember the Maine? This is the Maine. The Maine sank under a suspected torpedo attack from Spain during the Spanish-American War in Cuba. This was in the harbor of Havana. And after the Maine sank in this horrific explosion, the American public gets ginned into this run-up to a war. We have this great war with Spain. America wins. And the Maine becomes this flashpoint for all of this happening, right? And so the Maine's very famous. So famous, in fact, that about 15 years after the Maine sinks, the US government, Congress, decides that it wants the Maine back. It wants to salvage this ship, almost like it wants to go find a fallen soldier on the battlefield. And so there's this great effort to salvage the Maine. And these are steel pylons that are built in this circular pattern around the Maine wreck site. It was sunk shallow in about 100 feet of water. And they built what's called a coffer dam. These pylons, they all connect, and then they slowly drain the inside of the circle like a bathtub, eventually until there's just the wreck sitting there in the mud. And they repair the Maine, and they remove all the other explosives and the valuables and the dead soldiers' bodies, and eventually they fill it back up, and the Maine floats again. And the idea was they wanted to give it a proper burial. Again, like a soldier, right? So all of this effort, all of this time, this is taxpayer money, right? And immense news coverage to refloat the Maine, tow it about 3 miles away from Cuba, and sink it again, right? And so again, all this was worth it because it meant something to the American people and the American public. Incidentally, this whole saga with the Maine concluded about 3 weeks before the Titanic sank, which was interesting because they were both very famous. They both sank within about 14 years of each other, but the Maine story ended at this point, and the Titanic's, as we know, was just beginning. Here's another famous one that we all can recognize in our time. Does anyone recognize which one this is? This is the Queen Mary. Good, great. I'm surprised to hear you can recognize it because it looks like so many other ships that sailed in its era. Queen Mary, of course, if we go down to Long Beach, you could see the Queen Mary, which sailed, I believe, until the 1960s, was bought by the city of Long Beach, its final port, that thought it would be this great tourist attraction. It was. It has since changed hands of owners so many times, more than a dozen times, and was just sold back to the city of Long Beach in 2021 after the last owner said, we can't do anything with this. The Queen Mary needs so much extensive work, only because it's old. It has been sitting in water for almost a century. And that's what happens to ships. They get corroded, and the salt water and the chemical reactions with the water and the sun just eat away. And so I do not believe that the Queen Mary will be in Long Beach, unfortunately, for the rest of my lifetime. But we'll see. But you could see why Long Beach and all these other private owners wanted the Queen Mary, because it looks so classic. And here's the Titanic, right? The Queen Mary doesn't look that different from the Titanic, the 3 smokestacks, the 4, right? But overall, it looks like a really classic old ship that people would want to be near, just like you'd want to be near a celebrity, right? It's famous. It means something. You have social currency by telling someone you saw it or you went on it, right? Here's another famous one that is also just kind of living out its days in dock. This is the SS United States. If you've ever been to Philadelphia, maybe you've seen it. If you have been to the IKEA in Philadelphia, you've definitely seen it because it is right across the way from the cafeteria. And that's kind of its main purpose at the moment. It's kind of this lounge act for the IKEA cafeteria. But it's also an old ship that is quickly aging again, that feels like a violation to get rid of because it meant something for so long. This is a ship that carried Harry Truman and Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra, right, on the high seas. Very classic, very famous, and so it feels wrong to do anything but keep it going a little longer. Oh yes, I'll show you that. If you could see on the very top of the ship, there's a banner that says SaveTheUnitedStates.org. So if you feel compelled, visit the website. Yeah. And the last reason, the one that I dangled and was going to tell you about, people love ships for gold. Gold and other valuable things, but treasure in every way. This is a part of East Florida that is historically known as the Treasure Coast because of so many wrecks that have wrecked there, right? This is not a conspiracy like the Bermuda Triangle. Why do ships wreck there? It's very well known why a lot of ships wreck on the east coast of Florida. It was a popular trading route for colonial ships, especially that went from Spain or Portugal across the Atlantic and then down to colonies in South America, in Venezuela, Colombia, and all through Brazil, Argentina. And they generally sail up the east coast of the Americas and then cross over at the shortest point. This is a part of the ocean, of course, we know, that is prone to rough weather, hurricanes. And so a lot of these ships that were overloaded with gold that was plundered from their colonies eventually met their end prematurely in this area. And I think in the summer of 1976, this all came to a head, and with very little regulation in this field, treasure hunters would go out, sometimes with several different boats and with armed guards on board, and basically just see what they could find. And some of them reported their findings, some didn't, and it was a free-for-all. There's since a lot of laws passed about what's property of the state of Florida, what goes to court to be property of the Spanish government, what belongs to Spain versus Colombia versus Venezuela. So it's no longer an activity that anyone could just do. But I do want to speak for a moment about how you find some of these. And the idea of going out to search for treasure sounds easy, but is actually very, very difficult, even in shallow water. Right? So you can't really see underwater, and those of you who have worked with wrecks know that under about 40, maybe 50 feet, the light starts to disappear, and much deeper, you really can't depend on light bouncing back to a surface ship. So the only way to see underwater is to hear underwater, right? Using sonar. And this is just a rendering of a ship that you could see is sending down sonar waves. They bounce back. And hopefully they do it in enough, they do these giant transects, they call it mowing the lawn, back and forth. And if you get enough data, you could kind of spot something on the seafloor. Sometimes it's a rock, sometimes it's a giant rock, and sometimes it's an old wreck. Hopefully it's the wreck you're looking for, but in this part of the ocean in Florida, there's a lot of other wrecks too. So it's a very difficult process, let alone to go down and excavate it eventually when you do find it. But there was someone who was really, really good at this. This is a shipwreck hunter named Mel Fisher. Has anyone been to his museum in Florida? I don't see any hands. Yeah, okay. Mel Fisher has his own museum that has his own findings, and he's a very colorful guy. Yeah, I don't know where in Florida it is, but Key West. Classic place for it, perfect place for it, yeah. Mel Fisher found the most valuable shipwreck of all time, known as the Atocha, a Spanish galleon ship that was carrying as much as $500 million in gold. Mel Fisher found it about 40 years ago, and it was a huge day. I mean, you could just see from this grin on his face what that meant to find. Interestingly, it wasn't all his. And when shipwrecks are found, especially if they're carrying immensely valuable material, they usually start these giant legal battles, like I mentioned, between everyone who might have claim to any part of the ship. This is true for modern ships, when there's insurance companies involved and lawyers and ships registered in different countries carrying cargo from other countries and passengers from even more countries. But back then, this was pretty clear. This was a Spanish ship. But the governments of Colombia and Venezuela said, well, this was our gold. I mean, it originated with us. And Spain was saying, no, it was our ship. We had it. We colonized you. And Mel Fisher was saying, well, I found it, he had it, yeah. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, who generally did side, and courts generally side with the salver, the person who finds it, under the general legal principle that if they didn't do the work, it would still be lost. And so they deserve a huge portion of it. Mel Fisher, I think there was some shady business with how he distributed it to all of his investors, whether he did keep all of his commitments. But it's about what you'd expect from a guy who goes digging deep for buried, lost treasure, almost like a modern pirate. Mel Fisher had two sayings every day that he was on the high seas. Today's the day, and finders keepers. He loved saying both. So we got to the Titanic. So here's the Titanic, as I showed you earlier, the most famous of all wrecks, the North Star of all wrecks. It's the ship that everyone loves talking about, but people who really love shipwrecks are kind of tired of talking about. As I mentioned, there's a lot of interesting famous wrecks in the world. How did this one get to be so famous, right? I wrote a book not about this wreck, or this ship, that we've all seen the movie about, we've all read books about, we all know, who was on it, who got in which lifeboats, what the band was playing at which moments, right? This book is about this wreck underneath. This is what generally the wreck looked like about 5 years ago. There are new scans coming out every year that go down to the wreck site and show its gradual deterioration. This is a generous view of what much of the bow looks like. Here's another artist rendering of how it looks. The bow is in the Titanic broke in half. The bow is in much greater condition than the stern for the basic hydrodynamic reason that the bow fell kind of in a more efficient way and stabbed itself into the mud in a way that reduced the stress. The stern kind of just flattened and pancaked itself and has also been studied by archaeologists. Here are the first photos that we saw in the 1980s when the wreck was found in 1985. I think it's fascinating that this was the most famous wreck for most of the 20th century. Its sinking coordinates were well known on the very night it sank, and yet it took more than 70 years to find it. And the reasons are similar to the Endurance. It sank in a very punishing part of the ocean. It's very challenging to do anything in the North Atlantic. It's also very deep, 2.5 miles deep. In addition to having very low light, no light really, intense and crushing ocean pressure that make any kind of craft, even a sonar unmanned craft, very difficult to go look for it. Here's another photo that we saw of one of the staircases in the 80s. The man who found it, which I'll get to shortly, we know did not have just immense smarts on his side. He also had great luck and happened to be looking in a part of the ocean that he was also, we learned recently, looking for 2 nuclear submarines for the US Navy. And they gave him the equipment and the time to go find those, and if he had more time, to find the Titanic. And so that's how we saw these photos in the 80s. If not for that effort, probably the Titanic wouldn't have been found until the 90s or even later. The main character of my book, this is not a textbook about wrecks and going through all of them as I've done, it's a character-driven story, and this is the main character, a fascinating guy who embodied shipwreck obsession. His name's Doug Woolley, lived in England, and from early on in the 1950s, when he was a boy, he became fascinated, like many young kids, especially boys. And he grew his fascination into an obsession to the point where he decided that he wanted to own the Titanic, own what was left of it. And he concocted this master plan that he was going to buy the salvage rights from whoever owned them. And when he found out that nobody really owned them, he just claimed them. And this is like shaky legal ground, as many of us know, right? But he had no trouble staking claim and getting coverage, publicity about it. I went to visit Doug Woolley in the waning pre-pandemic days and was in his apartment and asked him, you said for years that you owned the Titanic and it was yours and you had legal papers. Can I see any of them? And he said, just look at my newspapers. And he was brilliant at ginning up news coverage for something that didn't really even exist, and then leveraging it into even more news coverage. And he did this over the course of decades until he had kind of combined his own identity with the wreck of the Titanic. He was Mr. Titanic, as you can see. He never got married, never had kids. This was his first and last love. He wanted to save its life, and at his lowest moments in life, his associations with the Titanic saved his life. So he's a really fascinating guy who really went really deep and had a singular goal his entire life. Here's just a couple more newspapers. I stopped taking pictures after about 200 of them because there were so many. But he was a truly fascinating man, unlike any I'd ever met, and a very colorful character who makes for a compelling character to follow in my book. I really enjoyed getting to know him. This is the man who found the Titanic. This is Bob Ballard, very, very accomplished former Navy oceanographer who's had a long career, not just with the Titanic, but after the Titanic as well. I mentioned the immense luck he had on his side the night he found it. He's had even greater luck since. He has truly become Mr. Titanic. He has consulted in all of the major books and films that have been made about the wreck, all of the archaeological excavations going down that deep. It really kind of embodied him, and it grabbed him in a way that he was even uncomfortable with. He had grown up also, like Doug Woolley, as a boy, fascinated by this wreck. And when he eventually sees it, this photo on the top, he's a little disappointed. It's really, really ugly, right? He's imagining this shiny, super well-kept, clean, polished ship that he had read about his whole life. And it kind of looks like someone sneezed on it, And so he even said at the time, he said, I really liked this thing and I really loved it, but I don't know if I want to be married to it the rest of my whole life. That changed for him, starting in the 90s and certainly to today when he realized what an enormous economy there is for the Titanic. And it's impossible to estimate. I wrote in the book that trying to judge the full-time value of the Titanic is like trying to judge the value of the color blue. It's so big, it's just unreachable. Bob Ballard has been consulting, as I mentioned. He has also been on the speaking circuit for many decades about this story and has had a lot of success with it. It's also enabled him to raise money and go look for other wrecks. And I know about 2 years ago, he was on an expedition in the Pacific to find the lost plane of Amelia Earhart, one of the other great wreck mysteries. They have not found it yet. Because of Ballard, because of the finding, because of seeing the wreck up close in the 80s, it really boosted this story from the 20th century again, and in a much bigger way. We all saw the film in 1997. The Titanic's been made into a large number of stage productions, of live shows. Again, I mentioned speeches, books, collector's items, and memorabilia. You can actually buy on eBay a piece of rust from the Titanic site. The starting bid when I was writing was $2,000 for a piece of rust, but people love this stuff, and it means something, again, because it's really famous. Here on the bottom right is the museum that was built in Belfast a little more than 10 years ago at the site where the Titanic was built. And again, there's no Titanic there. The Titanic has left that building, but it was so valuable and such a magnet for the region that they built this museum and tried to have this kind of great architect to model the Sydney Opera House or the Guggenheim, the great pieces of architecture in the world. And it has become a major tourist attraction and a big buoy of that economy just by being associated with the Titanic. There are 3 Titanics in the world still above water. The 2 on the left here are in Branson, Missouri and Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Again, places with no real claim to the Titanic except that it's a tourism draw. And they are both half-scale replicas of half of the ship. And on the top, you could see even the iceberg looks a little tacky. But people love to come take photos with both of them. On the right side, you could see this is a full-scale replica being built in a province in Western China. That the Titanic story is especially popular in China. And this is going to be what they call a 7-star resort for people to come and stay on the Titanic. It's being built in water, but it will never sail. It's just going to float kind of like the Queen Mary. It has run into a lot of financing problems and a lot of questions about whether it will actually finally come to pass, like many efforts to build the Titanic. Now, I want to conclude by talking about the great news story of this summer, one of the great ones, back in June when we heard about people who wouldn't be happy just seeing these Titanics. They wanted to see the real thing, to go down, see it with their own eyes, and maybe even find a way to get a piece of something down there to bring back up. And so we've heard that to go down that deep is really dangerous, and it is. I wouldn't do it, but people do. And to go down deep is inherently not that dangerous. People have been doing it for a long time. In fact, this is a craft that went down to the deepest part of the ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Pacific Ocean, more than 7 miles deep, almost 3 times deeper than the Titanic, in 1960. All right, 60 years ago. A couple Navy pilots and an adventurer, they went down. This is called the Trieste. And it was built specifically to go down that deep. And the humans sit in that little bulging ball at the bottom, which is made of steel and I believe some amount of titanium. And the top is much of its ballast, filled with water, and then it releases the water and fills it with air so it could come back up. But again, you could go down 7 miles. So to go down 2.5 is inherently not that dangerous. People did it. People have gone down to Challenger Deep since then also. Here's a craft called the Alvin that Bob Ballard has used to go down to the Titanic. It has also gone down several dozen, if not hundreds of times. What makes this so safe is it's built of titanium and steel, and its occupants sit toward the front in a cylindrical shape also. Right? So what made the craft that went down this summer so different was mostly its shape. Right? This was the Titan that was part of a company called Ocean Gate that was selling seats on board to go down, starting at $150,000. Eventually, there was so much demand, they raised it to $250,000, and that's what the price that people paid who went down this summer. So it was based on an experimental design, basically carbon fiber. Here's how it was made. Instead of titanium and steel, it was made by having titanium endpoints and carbon fiber wrapped around, kind of like you'd wrap a spool of thread. But really strong carbon fiber, built in association with NASA. Right? Here's generally how it was built, the carbon on the side, the titanium. A couple interesting things about this. One, they thought that because it was so cylindrical, it wouldn't crush, it wouldn't collapse, because the force would be even on all sides. Generally true, worked better in space than, of course, with 6,000 pounds of pressure per square inch underwater. Also, on the sides, where the seams, where the titanium meets the carbon, getting those bonds exactly right and exactly strong enough to withstand that pressure turned out to not work as well. Now, interestingly, this design did work for several, I think about 50 to 60 times that they took it down to the Titanic, but it weakened each time. And so here's the Titan compared to the Alvin on the right side. Again, you could see the shape difference. The cylinder is much different from the sphere. The sphere held the pressure much better. It still does. Here was the Titan, I think several times before it went down. You could imagine sitting in it. Maybe you could imagine. I could not imagine sitting in it or going down. But to want to see the Titanic so bad, to get in this little thing, to go down for a couple hours and come back up, was the great adventure of a lot of people's lives, of people who dreamed of it and who eventually did it. The implosion that we heard about on the news was not as dramatic as it sounds. First, it happened extremely fast, a fraction of a second. And it also wasn't that loud. It wasn't like an exploding bomb. It was just kind of a little collapse, like a tiny balloon just, in the middle of the water. And so fortunately, the unfortunate people who passed away on this died quickly. But also, it was one of the great lessons of ocean pressure in real time, because we've never done experiments where we send things down and implode them at that depth that quickly. So the Navy, which of course had microphones everywhere and maybe even cameras in that part of the ocean, is able to study this and understand exactly how pressure works when the integrity weakens as it did. One of the reasons it took so long, relatively about 4 days, to find the Titan is because this is basically the best imagery they had to work with. Here's the wreck of the Titanic, the bow on the bottom left here. The Titan was toward the top right. But in between all those rocks and other things that could be something and could not. So you can imagine looking at this from 2.5 miles up and not knowing exactly what you're looking at and trying your best and knowing that you might be racing against the clock. Here was the Titan when it came up. You could see it got crushed, but not unrecognizably. Most of its structure stayed, but of course it was no longer operating as a workable craft. This did teach underwater engineers lessons about how to keep this kind of research going. Number one, the cigar shape is probably never going to be used in underwater submersibles ever again. And the sphere shape with titanium and steel will allow more people and more researchers to go to more deep parts of the world than ever before. Probably for cheaper. I imagine, if I had to guess, I think it'll be about 5 to 10 years before another company starts selling tickets for a different type of design to go down and see the Titanic, just to meet the demand, which is always huge. I want to end on a happier note and show you this photo that I took when I went to visit Doug Woolley. He's the character I mentioned, and he plays a much bigger part in my book than in my talk tonight. But Doug was fascinated by shipwrecks. He was fascinated by ships. This was his apartment in London. Doug was not a hoarder, but he was very, very close, very close. And you could see kind of behind him, this great shipwreck memorabilia and all these wrecks and all these captain's hats and tickets and certificates and everything that he had kept. And at first, I looked at him and I thought, God, what a kook, what a colorful guy that he got so fascinated. But as I mentioned earlier, I started to see Doug as deeper. I started to see some richness in him and in his character. He was an only child, came of age right around World War II, didn't have great friends, never had a great family that supported him, and he found something that gave him the satisfaction. And it stayed with him his whole life. And people laughed at him, especially when he claimed that he owned the Titanic. People laughed him out of rooms, and they dismissed him, and he lost friendships over it. At one point, he faced financial ruin because of how much money he had put into this whole endeavor, and he never lost sight. And even when he was 83, and I went to visit him in 2020, I asked him kind of retrospectively, was it worth it? Was it fun? Why'd you do it all? And he looked at me and he said, oh, it's not that I haven't raised the Titanic, it's just that I haven't done it yet. And I didn't know if he was joking with me, and really, wow. And he wasn't. He was being real. He had devoted so much of his mental and emotional energy for so long into this goal of not only finding, but eventually raising the Titanic, that he was unwilling to let it go until he died. He died about 4 months ago. And I was sad when I heard about it. And then I thought, wow, what a remarkable bit of character to stay true to your goal no matter what anyone says. My wife and I, we have a 2-year-old son. We're in the value stage with him, thinking about what we want to teach him and what we think is important to pass on to him. And I think it's a goal like this, that find what you believe in, stick to it. If people dismiss you, keep going, and eventually you'll have a great identity that you've built of your own. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to take questions. All right. Yeah. I'm happy to take questions, or should...
They'll raise their hand.
Okay. I'm a little blinded here, but yes, right in front.
So what?
I'll repeat the questions for everyone, too.
What happened to his collection? His Woolley's collection?
What happened to Doug Woolley's collection? Good question. That's not a great answer, but a lot of his friends got a lot of the stuff, and unfortunately, he was renting his apartment, and so when he got really infirm, his landlord gave him a lot of time and then cleared out his apartment. So it was really sad. However, I will say it was too much for anyone to take on, and not quite valuable enough for a museum to take in. Yeah, so good question. Did I see? Yes?
Did he will his Titanic to anybody?
Did Doug Woolley will the Titanic to anybody? You know, he told me when I was there, because one of his friends named Gary, younger guy, was there, and he said, I told Gary that when I die, there's a piece of paper behind that portrait of my mother for him. And I said, what is it? And he said, you'll have to wait to find out, you know, like a movie. I still don't know. I don't think it was a will, but no, he does not own the Titanic now. Yeah. Yes?
Can you say who does own the Titanic?
Who does own the Titanic? Great question. Okay, after the Titanic sank, there was a great flurry of insurance claims on it. Lloyd's of London paid out for more than a decade. It was in all the newspapers. They paid the claims on the people who died and on the ship itself from the White Star Line. At that point, Lloyd's of London really owned it. But there was nothing to own because no one knew where it even was or what kind of shape it was in or anything. It also wasn't like an instant rush to go get it. Nobody really wanted it. So that was what Doug Woolley really capitalized on in the 50s, that nobody owned it, so he could own it. Since then, it's become a World Heritage Site. There have been various legal claims by the US and the British government in different courts over who owns the artifacts, and those have been doled out in separate cases. Most of the artifacts now are owned by an events company in Atlanta called Experiential Media Group. And that's why, if you see a Titanic exhibit coming to your town, or you can go see the teacups and the boots and the diaries and whatnot, that's because those artifacts are owned under the condition that they are kept together and they are monetized in a certain way, but not totally exploited or sold. So who owns the wreck itself, the steel? No one really, but you could not go and just pick off pieces of metal, even if you could go down that deep, because it's a protected site. Yeah. Yes?
Has there been any effort to find the Lusitania?
Any effort to find the Lusitania? Lusitania is not lost, only because it sank in a very known place and in pretty shallow water. So the Lusitania has been known where it is, and it's been studied at great length because of how it sank, the conditions of the wartime kind of attack that people thought different things were on it, and munitions and people. So the Lusitania is not lost, but it is fascinating. There's a great book by a colleague of mine called Dead Wake by Eric Larson about the Lusitania.
But it's just there.
It's just there. Yeah, it's not in great shape either, but it's certainly not as deep as the Titanic. Yeah. Okay, so the construction generally of the Titan, its end caps that were supposed to be single-use bolts, but were used multiple times. That is true. I do not know about the propellers and the engine and its ballast. Those will be forensic questions that are either not known yet or will be known probably first by the Navy and might not release all of it. But it generally was an engineering and construction failure. Very embarrassing for the CEO of the company who was on board, for the company itself, and really a black eye for much of the industry. So I don't think we're going to be hearing about Titanic tourism imminently, but I do think it'll come back. Yes, but yeah.
Get a chance to see the Hunley in Charleston?
Have I had a chance? Have I had a chance to see the Hunley in Charleston? No, I know about it. I have not seen it. What's interesting about the Hunley, and a lot of other ships that people have mentioned to me during my tour for this book, people have close associations with wrecks that meant something to them as a kid. No one more than the Edmund Fitzgerald, right? And those of you who might be from the Midwest know about the Edmund Fitzgerald because there's a song, right? There's a song about the Edmund Fitzgerald. I don't even remember how it goes. Someone will sing it after the event. You can look it up on YouTube. But that speaks to the storytelling component that's behind the Hunley or the Edmund Fitzgerald or the Lusitania or the Endurance or Titanic. These ships that have storytelling lore behind them become these great bright stars in the sky, many of which are in cases around the room here, are the famous ships. There are many other ships that did remarkable things that just kind of never kind of catch the wave of history. They are still just as interesting, and there are thousands, if not millions of them. Yes?
In 2005, I had
Okay, so this gentleman went to the Maritime Museum in Vancouver and met with the director and got to hold a piece of the Titanic. Was it like in your hand or a big piece? Yeah, in your hand. Okay, there are pieces of the Titanic. One of the biggest ones is actually at the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. It's just a sheet of steel. It's not anything special, but it is made more special by that. It's the Titanic. I think there's probably a few hundred of those around the world in different museums. You know, it's very attractive to be able to say, this was the Titanic, or this was on it, or this was a rivet, or this was a piece of rust. I don't think it's very wide. You know, I don't think in that case, but I think there are cases where it can be counterfeited very easily. A mangled piece of metal is very easy to reproduce. I'm not saying in that case, but it means something because of what it means. You know what I mean? Someone tells you it means something, and so it feels important, like holding a special diamond or something that meant something to your grandmother. It means something, yeah. Okay, yes? Not a lot of, I'm sorry, the Cuba sinking, I mentioned there was silver on board. Not a great deal. Yes, it was gotten, yes. It's not still there, unfortunately. I will just tell a brief story about the Chickasaw, one of the other ships out here in our channel. During the writing of this book, when I was researching Doug Woolley and the way he just claimed a wreck and no one really stopped him, I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if I just claimed a wreck and owned a wreck and could go to parties and tell everyone, you know, that's my wreck. And I even called the company that owned the Chickasaw when it sank. It's called the Waterman Company. And I even talked to a couple lawyers, and I said, I want to, you know, just sign it over. And they all told me the same thing. They said, you know, the amount of liability that you're signing up for to own a giant piece of rusting nothing is crushing. So my wife was grateful I spoke with those lawyers, but I still think it would be cool. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
The very first commercial movie that was shown here in Santa Barbara was in 1898, and it was about the sinking of the Maine in Cuba.
Wow, the first film shown here in Santa Barbara was shown in 1898, I assume in black and white, silent, about the sinking of the Maine in Cuba. This was the great event that sparked the great newspaper war between Hearst and Pulitzer, made both men very rich, they both already were rich, and led us into war. So I'm not surprised it was a giant American event that was made into a film. Yeah, interesting, didn't know that. Yes, Mari.
What's your next book?
What's my next book? My next book's about a woman named Alice Hamilton, who was like the Erin Brockovich of the 1920s, who fought against a major American company, General Motors, when they started putting lead into gasoline. She thought it was a terrible idea. She was right. And she fought against the main engineer who invented it at GM. So it's the story of the two of them in great conflict of how they wanted to transform the world in the 20s. It's going to be called The Doctor and the Devil. It'll probably come out next year. Yeah. So thank you for asking.